Durante anos, os varejistas observam o crescimento de empresas de tecnologia como Apple, Facebook, Google e a própria Amazon. Alguns com as estratégias que, inclusive, envolvem essas empresas. Agora, porém, elas devem começar a nivelar o campo de jogo com essas empresas. Ela é bacharel em economia pela Universidade de Harvard e possui MBA pela Stanford Graduate School of Business. Antes da Forrester, foi diretora de marketing da Saks Fifth Avenue, onde gerenciava os esforços de aquisição, retenção e pesquisa de mercado do canal online do varejista de luxo de mais de 2 bilhões de dólares. Ela é uma autoridade mundial no desenvolvimento de tecnologias que afetam o setor de comércio online e fornecedores que facilitam o marketing e o merchandising online. Bom, gente, para o benefício do nosso próximo convidado, eu vou mudar para o inglês. Well, to talk to us about it's time for retail to challenge the tech titans, I'd like to introduce you from Charlotte, North Carolina, United States, Sucharita Kodali, Vice President and Principal Analyst at Forrester Research. Sucharita, it's a pleasure to have you. Please, the UK stage is yours.
Okay, I can start?
Yes, please. Okay. Can you hear me?
All right.
Yes.
Thank you. So I am going to talk today about the technology titans and why they matter both to the retail industry and to the Brazilian market. So first, when we're talking about the tech titans, let me explain who I mean. It is 4 companies. It's Google, Apple, Amazon, and Facebook. And I thought it would be useful to share just a little bit of data about how prevalent and important these companies are in the lives of. Now, this is data from Forrester, and when we survey Brazilian consumers, we are surveying metro Brazilian households, so people who live in the larger cities and have internet access. So amongst those consumers, almost 100%, 98% of Brazilians are using Google weekly. 81% are using YouTube. Facebook is the other company that has a lot of adoption in Brazil. 87% of Brazilians are using Facebook weekly, and 93% use WhatsApp, which of course is also owned by Facebook. Now, Apple is probably the company that is the least used here in this market. Although if you do happen to be one of the consumers with an Apple phone, it's very much a part of your life. But it is the 3rd largest device from a mobile phone standpoint. And I know that this data point about Amazon is surprising to people. But again, keep in mind that these are Brazilians who live in larger cities. And what we know from our consumer data is that 31% of Brazilians purchased from Amazon in the last 3 months. And that itself would not be as shocking if it were not for the fact that just 1 year ago, when we ran the same survey, that number was half of 31%. So it's been tremendous growth in a short period of time. And that means that it's taking share away from traditional retail. Now, these companies have experienced massive changes in how consumers see them. And in many ways, it is from what I will describe as deification, which is that they are perceived to be like gods, which was the image on the left-hand side, where you have Steve Jobs as Jesus Christ. But on the right-hand side, it's more akin to the way that these companies are viewed now, which is that they are more a wolf in sheep's clothing, as the expression goes. These are companies that need to be viewed suspiciously and with suspicion because they aren't always as friendly as they may seem. Now, as a society, we've realized that these issues have been prevalent for years and years and years, where the questions around how these companies take data, use data, whether or not they are dominating their different markets, has been around for a long, long time. But really, only in the last few years, particularly when our elections have been completely distorted by some of the actions of these large technology companies, has it actually attracted attention. And even though as consumers we use many of these services very frequently, the big question becomes, do the pros, the positive benefits, where we get a lot of free services on the internet, does that outweigh the cons, which is that in some cases democracy may be distorted, or our data could be abused, or in the case of retail, you may find yourself with some unfair competition. And what I would really say is that there has been a bit of a change in the attitudes of retailers in particular with respect to how they are. Um, really perceiving and having relationships with the large technology companies. I would say from the beginning of the days of e-commerce to about 2012, it was an era of what I will describe as sloth, and which is just laziness. That retailers thought, hey, we're doing okay. We're still growing our sales. Retail is doing okay, so we're not worried about the technology titans. And in fact, companies like Facebook didn't even exist for much of that time. And even Google was seen as, oh, this is a great service, not anything that needs to be viewed with suspicion. But then from about 2012 to 2016, these companies started to go public. They were publicly traded in the stock market. Others started to see how much their valuations were. The technology titans had CEOs and employees who were some of the richest in the world, and everyone else who was an advertiser or even adjacent to those platforms viewed these companies with what I'll call greed and envy. And what that means is that they really, really wanted to make money from these titans. And this is, in many ways, the some of the biggest challenge that we have to, as an industry, unwind ourselves from, because the point of view was that we need to be where the customers are. And as a result of that, so many retailers just simply provided their data and spent a large part of their marketing budgets with these companies. But then that gave way to the era that I'll call anger. So you notice these are like the seven deadly sins, but we have four of them right here. So the anger is really anger that we now have as consumers and as other competitive businesses, with the notions that companies like Google would say their motto was "Don't be evil," but then finally we're beginning to question whether or not that actually is true, whether or not working with them has done more harm than good. And that's where we are currently now. Now, interestingly, even in spite of the anger, these companies are on what I would say on fire. These are their stock prices, and they've just been just straight rocket ships up. Amazon, in particular, even through the pandemic, has done particularly well. But not only have these companies done really well with the markets, they have actually done really well with retailer marketing spend. And that is the heart of this presentation here. So this is data from a survey that I do with an American trade association called the National Retail Federation. And we survey retailers about a lot of different retail tactics. And one of the questions we ask is, where do you spend your marketing dollars? And are you spending more of your marketing dollars with any of these types of companies? Are you spending it on search with Google, in social with Facebook or Instagram, or on other sites like Amazon? Because now Amazon has advertising on its site as well. And as you can see, almost across the board, the percent of retailers that are spending on all of these tactics is significantly large. It is double digits, strong double digits. It's increasing in the case massive search, and it's definitely increasing in the case of Amazon to some degree at the expense of Facebook. But nonetheless, in spite of all these retailers leaning into these technology companies, I will argue that the retailer growth has been much smaller than the Titan growth, and that is really the cause for concern. So I just want to point out, when we look at we go back and we look back to 30 years in retail, and in the 1990s and even in the early 2000s, that was the era that I would call the big box era. So you had large traditional stores. In the US, it was companies like Walmart. In Europe, or even in Latin America, it's companies like Carrefour. And the sales growth that those companies saw was triple digits. And then the brands, like packaged goods brands, consumer brands that would sell in those retail stores, were also growing. They were growing at, like, say, a double-digit pace of growth. But then when you look in the last 10 years, when you look at the Titan era, this is what I'll call the Titan era, what we see is that the Titans have grown tremendously rapidly, even faster than the large retailers did in the 90s and the 2000s. But what you've seen is that brands have actually declined in their growth in that same period of time. And even the retailers have declined substantially in the era of the Titans. And a very, very interesting data point that I want to call out on this slide is that there is a group of companies that I will call holdout companies. And what that means is that they were not the companies that invested in the retail marketing that was on these large technology sites like Google and Facebook. So they chose to invest in their own digital channels, not in the marketing of these large technology companies. And what's really interesting is that the holdouts outperformed the companies that were marketing the most on these technology Titan platforms. So I just want to point out that these Titans were growing, but they were not bringing along the other players in the retail ecosystem that they were asking their advertising dollars from. And I think that there is a really important analogy here, which is that as an industry, we invested in and gave a lot to these Titans. We gave our data, we gave our money, because there was a belief that these were companies that were better, faster, stronger, and you had to work with them, or otherwise you would be left behind. But in fact, I'm going to argue that they've grown and they have not helped the other companies that have been on their platforms. And a lot of their growth has come because they were unfairly advantaged. And that is a very, very different paradigm. It's a different dynamic to consider. And to that end, I would say that the retail playbook needs to change. But before we get to what the playbook, how it changes, it's really important. Is everything okay? I'm hearing some voices in the background. It's really important that we understand what the playbook is. And the playbook is three things. It's idol worship, brand mismanagement, and a failure to protect one's own data. So idol worship, first of all. So we have worshipped these technology companies more than anything in the world. And what I have here is data from Brazil, Argentina, and Mexico on the type of ads that that consumers ignore. And what you'll see here is that everything on the left-hand side are the types of ads that people are more likely to ignore. And everything on the left-hand side are the things that people are more likely to pay attention to. You'll notice that on the right-hand side are all the internet ad formats. And in fact, ads on social networks and search engines, which is where so many companies are spending more of their resources on, actually are not paid attention to. Meanwhile, the things that everybody is pulling away from, like traditional advertising, like ads on TV or outdoor ads, those are the things that people actually do pay attention to. And I also want to point out that in-store ads are really effective, but a lot of retailers don't even think about that. Now, I also want to point out that, we have worshipped so much of these companies. So I don't know, I want to go back into the past, but I don't know if you remember back from 2011, Facebook had launched these, what they called Facebook stores. And so many companies, talked about how they wanted Facebook stores. And in fact, this data shows that one of the things that retailers back then invested in more than anything were Facebook stores. Well, Facebook stores were useless, but the only reason that everybody thought they needed to invest in it was because they worshipped everything that Facebook did. Same thing with apps, is that Apple launched its App Store, and around 2012, you had a huge percent of retailers investing in an iPhone app, when it turns out that ultimately most retailers didn't even need an iPhone app because they didn't get enough visits from their customers in any given year to justify an app. Now you still get people wanting to do voice commerce and things like dash buttons, and Amazon doesn't even support the dash button anymore. And so few customers are even using voice assistants or even using them for shopping. But yet you have a huge percent of brands that are investing in Alexa skills. And now the thing that I think is really, really crazy is that you have 15% of retailers that we surveyed saying that they're investing in like robot delivery and drones, even though, again, not only is it, not really, but there are not even the laws to support drone delivery. But again, because Google and Amazon have invested in it, there's this belief that everybody needs to play with that as well. And then the worst of all is like expedited free shipping. Like retailers think that they've got to offer free shipping, especially fast free shipping. But in fact, and not only do customers not want it, which is what the data on the left side says, but the amount of money that is spent to get customers their items that they want as quickly as a company like Amazon delivers it, and this applies also to other companies like Alibaba and others, is more than $27 billion, which, by the way, is the GDP of Estonia. So unless you as a retailer have as much money as the GDP of Estonia and you're willing to invest it in something like this is not something that you need to do. Okay. The second big thing is brand mismanagement. And I just want to quickly go through the fact that brands have distributed in a really, really sloppy way over history. They distribute directly through retail, they distribute through distributors who are third parties, or they distribute through direct to consumer. And all of this merchandise in some way or shape or form ends up online. And sometimes you'll have small retailers ending stuff online, and you end up with a gray market. And for many merchants, it can take years for a brand to even figure out that there's product on the gray market and that it is available, visible, and transparent online. So that ultimately leads to all kinds of pricing distortions and, kind of all sorts of products that are available for sale that shouldn't be. And then sometimes products will be on sale at a retail store, and then consumers will actually buy those items on sale and resell them again on a marketplace. And that ends up being called something called retail arbitrage. And then you will even have retailers with direct-to-consumer sites, but these brands have really, really uncompelling direct-to-consumer where they don't even give consumers a compelling reason to purchase on their site. So here's an example of a cell phone cover from a brand, and it's actually a pretty high quality product that's sold at like the Apple stores. But when you buy that product on the brand site, it's almost $20, $19.99. But when you go to Amazon and purchase the same item, it's less than half the price. So of course nobody's going to purchase it on the direct to consumer site when that is the price differential. The third thing that retailers really have a problem with is something called the failure to protect one's own data. And certainly we've seen this through Facebook and Google, where, of course, everybody was well-versed in the Cambridge Analytica scandal and the usage of consumer data for political purposes. And we've seen the EU fine Google for its online advertising purposes. And it's not just consumer data that has been exploited. You also have the data from third-party sellers as well. And in fact, Amazon on its marketplace is being investigated by the EU for exactly this. There's actually an antitrust, kind of symposium. There's an inquisition actually of all of the CEOs of these technology companies tomorrow in the US by the US Congress. And Jeff Bezos has to answer to exactly this question tomorrow, is whether or not he and his company is stealing data from third-party sellers in order to enhance its own private label, or in order to help the Amazon products at the expense of some of these sellers. So just to summarize, net, this has been the playbook. It's been a playbook of worshiping these idols blindly. It has been about mismanaging brands, allowing rogue content to be everywhere and not to, kind of have a good handle on their merchandise. And then both consumers as well as companies not protecting their data adequately. And as a result of this, what we've seen is that the titans grow at everybody else's expense. And the question is, what do we do now? Do we keep going in the direction that we're going and we continue to worship them and let them grow and everybody else continues to sputter along? Or do we call foul, change our behavior, and do something to gain some of those sales back and, kind of not be party to, kind of where their revenues come from? And I would actually argue we can do that is more along the lines of crying foul. The first thing that we can do is not to idolize these companies, especially when they come up with stupid initiatives like, like stores that nobody wants to buy from, but learn what really, really works. And what works about these companies is that they hire really well. They're incredibly innovative. They're very diversified. They're very creative, and they're known for their automation and continuous improvement. So from a hiring practices standpoint, I think this is so important, is that I have worked at a lot of different companies in my career. And one of the things that I've noticed is that companies are often very fast to hire because they often just need somebody to fill a role. But then it takes forever, if somebody is not a good fit, to either coach them or to, kind of replace them. But what is different about these technology companies is that they have what's called bar raisers. Amazon does in any case. And what they do is that they actually know who are the people who are really good at identifying talent, because they've collected data on, kind of who interviews who, what kind of score did they give these employees, and who ultimately stayed with the company. And those people are assigned the task of interviewing all subsequent employees. Facebook also has committee-based hiring, and the hiring manager actually doesn't even hire the candidate. It is, it's this committee of people who are assigned with whether or not that person actually is capable. Google has a junior management rotation program that is supposed to be one of the best in the business. They collect data on who interviews, and then they are always interviewing. If a person is interested in potentially working for them, they take notes on that person, and it could be years before that person gets called again, because that may be when the next role is. But that's the approach, is always be on the lookout. Innovation is in their DNA. A company like Amazon issues multiple press releases every single week about new products, and I challenge most retailers to do something at that cadence, because in many cases they may be issuing one or two press releases a week. These companies are constantly disrupting themselves. And I added Microsoft to this list too, because I think that it's interesting. When you look at where their revenue came from in the year 2000 and where their revenue comes from now, it's completely different. And I would challenge any retailer to go back and look at your revenue from 2000, and is it different or is it the same right now? Because in the cases of most retailers, their revenue mix is exactly the same. And that is the hallmark of not being innovative. These companies are also excellent at automation, and every part of their business is really about self-service and being self kind of self-subsistent. And there's some stuff that you see visibly that's automated with a company like Amazon. Like you see the Fire device or their Alexa device or anything that is consumer facing. But there is it's like an iceberg where there is so much that you don't see that's under the surface. And every single one of those aspects, whether it's a logistics issue, an inventory issue, kind of how their recommendation engines work, all of that is equally automated. And that is what allows the company to scale. These companies also do embrace the user experience, and in many ways, they have groundbreaking hardware and even software experiences that are simple yet extremely effective in what they accomplish, whether it is the shape of the Echo device, or, of course, the revolutionary design of the iPhone, or even the simplicity of a Google search box. And that ability to really serve the needs of the customer in such a simplistic way is incredibly important, because some of the things that you don't think about with Amazon or Apple is how much they focus on graphic design, or even Google, like whether or not they focus on graphic designers and how important they are to the brand. The next thing that companies need to do, especially with respect to brand mismanagement, is to establish what I call a format of e-control. Now, what is e-control? E-control is everything that's on this page. First, it is an authorized reseller program. So a lot of brands may have what you may have heard of called MAP, which is minimum advertised pricing. But really what an authorized reseller program is that in the age of the internet, you take all of that middle range of distributors and you cut them out. This is essentially what companies like Nike have started to do, Adidas, even Apple has started to do more of this, because in the age of the internet, when more people are purchasing online, you don't need distributors. You can go directly to consumers and you can have a few key accounts that you trust and that you know will sell your product and be true to your brand. Everything else you can better manage. And what that does is that takes what was the brand's revenue at wholesale in the past, and it reduces the supply somewhat. But in the course of reducing supply, what you do is that you maintain your brand presence and you maintain your brand strength, and you're able to sell more through your owned properties, through your direct-to-consumer property. So even though you are getting less revenue from your wholesale relationships, you're more than making it up with your direct-to-consumer sales. And that is really the guts of the point that we're making here. And the other piece to keep in mind about direct-to-consumer is that brands need to really, really be price competitive and be the best place to purchase anything. When we look at companies like hotel companies or airlines, and now Disney Plus is a streaming service where they have a lot of their proprietary content that used to be available on services like Netflix, but Disney now took all of that away and made it only available on Disney Plus. And as a result, they've seen tens of millions of people subscribe because of this unique content. If they had this content available in 15 different places, nobody would have subscribed to Disney Plus. And the same analogy applies to brands and direct-to-consumer sales. When you're available everywhere, you give people no reason to come and shop with you. The second thing is to track products and really limit some of that differentiation. One of the things that I really want to point out is kind of that brands, all companies should be forced to disclose how old, especially marketplaces, the merchandise on a site is. And I just want to share with you an example. So Amazon has this brand called J.Crew Mercantile on its site, and years ago it basically purchased a lot of J.Crew merchandise. And what happened is in 2018, J.Crew stopped manufacturing Mercantile. However, today, to this this day, you can search on Amazon and you can still find that J. Crew mercantile merchandise. So what consumers don't know is that what you are seeing is more than 2 years old. It's inventory that's very, very aged. So by knowing how old that merchandise is that's on the site, that actually provides more useful information to customers. But this is information that often marketplaces don't disclose and that brands historically haven't disclosed. I encourage companies to sue violators. This is something that that really depends case by case in different markets, but there are case laws that encourage that. And also, I encourage brands to do their own resale. And to Patagonia has basically it takes rather than allowing products to be on marketplaces, it resells old merchandise or used merchandise on its own site. The third thing that's really important to keep in mind about data and how to reduce your own reliance on the titans is every retailer has a marketing team. Look very, very carefully at your attribution models. Don't blindly accept methods from the past. You have to get out of the last click attribution. You have to have a more sophisticated method. So much of Google is still dependent on branded terms. A lot of Facebook ads are tailored to people who are already going to purchase with you. Really, really force the incrementality question. The second is to diversify your partners. Look at solutions like Reddit or kind of other House, Snapchat, others that could be your means of acquiring customers that are above and beyond some of these other players. And the third thing is to build your own brand and go back to some of those other advertising tactics that people actually pay attention to, like TV or magazines or even outdoor advertising. Because retailers think that it's super expensive, but if it's actually effective, it's more worth it than to continue to lean into, Google and Facebook. So what I'll end with is that whatever happens next depends on what retailers choose. This is my contact information for anybody that does want to see it. And I also encourage you to take a screenshot of this because we have a grocery event coming up in a couple of weeks, and would love for you to join. And here's the registration link. So thank you.
Hello? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, Sucharita. Thank you so much for that. That was fantastic. I think you can hear me, but can you see me as well?
I can't. Who am I seeing? I don't think I can see. I can see just the e-commerce Brazil.
Right. That's all right. That's all right. Well, thank you so much for that. Let me ask you one question. I have a couple actually, but let me start with the first one. I think you kind of answered that, but let me try it anyway. I think it's safe to say that these days everyone relies on these big guys, Google, Facebook, Amazon, for their analytics or marketing or advertising or all of it together. So how do you think, have you seen alternative successful strategies to how can brands these days can rely a bit less on these guys?
Well, you have to certainly invest in building your own brand, and that means driving everything from traditional marketing. It could be direct mail, it could be offline advertising, print advertising, TV advertising. Ultimately, the biggest brand builder, if you're a retailer, is great products and great customer service or reliable customer service. So those are certainly the big things. I would also encourage brands to look at other means of marketing. So whether I'd mentioned companies like a Reddit, which surprisingly has actually been a source of revenue for like Uniqlo. So you can create a lot of content. Content marketing can work. Snapchat is not owned by any of these large technology companies. So I encourage experimentation with lots of different channels and to explore as much of that as possible. And to even kind of engage in things like Shopify shoppable video on your own site, or partnering. I mean, I don't understand why a lot of retailers don't include things like inserts in other, packages with other non-competitive retailers. You can put a coupon or an ad, some kind of a catalog to your business in some other retailer's package. And, that's a great way to get exposure to somebody who's an e-commerce shopper.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Absolutely fantastic. What about the smaller guys, among the smaller retailers, the smaller e-commerces? I mean, technology requires a lot of investment sometimes. Of course, there are SaaS options, but technology most of the time requires investment either in the platform itself and the technology itself, or sometimes in putting together a team to run all this technology. How do you think the smaller guys can tap into technology and the innovation that comes from technology, since these guys don't have the same budget, the same capacity of investment that the big guys would have?
Yeah, I mean, that's essentially been the reason that Shopify has been successful, is that they are the the relatively low cost technology solution that's not Amazon for these other players. So using a platform like Shopify is an easy first step. But then what do you do when you're small and you don't have a brand? You're trying to get awareness. I mean, this is where getting back to all of those things that we had talked about, whether it is leveraging your fan base, your customer base, your good products, get word of mouth out there. At some point you do have to buy Google search terms, and that's fine. You can have, search engine optimization is definitely a big part of it. For small brands, though, I think that the bigger risk is that you become too dependent on the marketplaces, the third-party marketplaces. And that is where companies like Amazon in particular, that's where, they're being hauled to Congress tomorrow, is because there's the fear that they're taking data from those small sellers to sell their own, to basically to steal the patents or the intellectual property and resell that merchandise. So you don't want to be too dependent on the marketplaces. You want to build your own brand first and develop your own customer database from there.
Yeah, your own data, right? Your understanding of your customer.
It's the first party data.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the final question, Sucharita, is something I think everyone will be willing to pick your brain. Since everything that has happened during this pandemic, all the innovation and the new trends, even the new behaviors that now are new to us, what do you think will stick after this whole crisis ends?
Yeah, I think that we have seen a lot of adoption of omni-channel almost everywhere in the world. And that means things like contactless curbside, in-store pickup so people can get in and out of a store very, very quickly. A lot of contactless everything, contactless transactions, contactless payments, contactless delivery, contactless doors. So you can open a door with your foot or, so definitely the contactless piece will stick. And then we also expect that, there is, they'll certainly be more delivery services, particularly in developing markets. Consumers have really embraced, delivery, often for the first time, restaurant delivery, grocery delivery, and the developing markets in particular, countries like Brazil, your cost of labor is a lot better than the cost of labor in Europe or in the US. And as a result of that, it actually is much, much more favorable. The bad news is that a lot of companies that had store infrastructures or companies that, were very dependent on physical real estate, they will be challenged because, you don't need as much of that anymore. And you either have to get rid of it or you are stuck paying the rent on it until your lease is finished.
Fantastic. Well, Sucharita, it's been a real pleasure. I'm a person, a big fan of your work and your experience. It's absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much for everything you shared with us today. I hope you had a great experience as well. We hope to see you soon.
My pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you.